Welcome, I'm Catherine Milner, Director of the Lake Forest Library, and it is my great pleasure to introduce historian and Professor Art Miller to give you a tour of the Lake Forest Library's unique art collection. Considered one of the city's civic jewels, the library and its art collection reflect the historic character of Lake Forest during the nationally significant Country Place era. So welcome, and I hope you enjoy the tour.
Hello, I'm Art Miller. I'm going to take you on a tour of the library, the Public Library in Lake Forest, and its 1931 building. We see here, we've entered the library through the vestibule and now in this entry hall, which is in Greek temple form with two gardens on the sides. They are an integral part of the plan for this building. If you look up, you can see the fixtures are in the style that's sort of of the period, which is 1931. They're not really Art Deco. They are more modern classicism, surrounded by the dome like they are. And if you see right behind me, you'll see that there are a very elaborate classical series of columns on two levels and pediments, so that the columns in a kind of Georgian style. So this gives you a sense of the kind of building you're entering, very classic, and led basically by Greek style. A little column. The column capitals have a canvas leaf capitals. The very front of the library, the sort of Greek temple form, has three parts to it. The central part is the entry, but on either side there is a stairway to the lower level. And this lower level has had the children's department in recent decades. So what we have here is a mural by Thomas Milner. This is a second phase of murals that he did in the late 90s. But it's wonderful for the large book that it shows on either side, and then the small book motif with the word read sprinkled through it. So it's like wallpaper almost. But the large book tells the children who are entering down the stairs that this is about books. So up above I stressed the modern classicism of the library building, but the conservative modernism is definitely on display in the lower levels at the foot of the stairs, where the water fountain is given very much of an Art Deco treatment. And it's almost like a temple for a water fountain, quite striking. But they had to add the bench later because little kids can't get up to that water fountain. So Arbor Day was very much of a Lake Forest holiday for the Lake Forest Garden Club. One member was Mrs. Joseph Cudahy, who was the daughter of Mr. Morton, who founded the Morton Arboretum. And she was later president of the Morton Arboretum after her father's death. So she was a granddaughter or great-granddaughter of the guy who founded Arbor Day. This window across the lobby illustrates the importance of books. But what's interesting is it's down in the late 90s, at a time when books were, some people thought, going to disappear, and would be replaced by computers. We know now that the computers are just one more thing, but this is asserting the importance of books and reading, certainly. Now this is the first phase here of the Children's Library foyer. It was done by Thomas Milner. This is earlier 1990s. And these are both, I think, given by the Friends of the Lake Forest Library. But the book motif is certainly strong, you can say. And if you look at the soil that the roots of the trees of books grow in, they are letters. The soil is brown letters, just like movable type. So this is a very, in some ways it's a reactionary statement, but it's meant for children to start by learning to use books. I'm standing next to an interesting, again I was stressing that conservative modernism emphasis on this lower level. This is one of the heating grates that shows all the geometric zigzag patterns, concentric lines, geometry. It's very typical of that period. Here we've got different periods in the library. The grate is from 1931. The mural above the children's desk is again by Thomas Melvin and shows books at the top of trees. And now we have a tree over here that's maybe a motif that he was picking up. This is a tree from the 1960s with two figures in it. This is Sylvia Shaw Judson Haskins. She was born, I think, in 1897, died in 1978. She did some important sculptures. One was in the Rose Garden, at least until it was recently redone. I don't know what happened since then. But did one for the Rose Garden at the White House, and she did a sculpture of a Mary Dyer, who was a martyr of Quakerism in Massachusetts in she did the sculpture, she was a 17th century martyr. The sculpture was done in 1957, and you could say that it reflected the tolerance issue that came up in the McCarthy era. But it sits right in front of the State House on the Common in Boston. So these two sculptures show children working, reading, and playing. And the young girl is reading, she's perhaps reading to her younger brother, and they're in an apple tree. And it's an unusual pose for a garden children's sculpture, but it's been here and is an important part of the fabric of the library. She did lots of works in Lake Forest, over the fountain. There's one of a girl about like this over the fountain in Market Square. So she was a pretty eminent sculptor of the period, daughter of architect Howard Van Der Shaw, and lived in his home from 1942 to 1978. Right behind me is the sculpture of the Archer by Oscar Hansen. He was in the period, the early 1930s and through the 30s, an important sculptor. This is in memory of Curtis Coates Reed. The building was given by his wife, or widow, because he died early in 1929, and his sister-in-law, Mrs. Charles Schweppen. They were both daughters of John Shedd Reed. And so what we see here is this very stylized, in the manner of the period, view of an archer flanked with classic pillars or pilasters. And he's holding an bow, an archer's bow, that is parallel to the other horizontals that are in this system. Okay, so now we'll look at that in the context of this whole building's room here. This is the central room in a cruciform plan. We came in through one of the things, the entrance hall area. Then on two sides there are reference rooms and a periodical room on the right. And then there's another room to the north that we'll see in a few minutes. But the cruciform plan, and there were smokestacks originally behind here. The cruciform plan was like similar buildings that had been given by the family, the Shedd family in New Hampshire for another library, and then the Shedd Aquarium was opened in the late 20s. So this is echoing that form. This is more of a Roman room because it has a dome above it. It's the only public building in Lake Forest that has a dome, and it's great. And then the simple classical detail of the chandelier heightens the element also for us. Now, two things I will mention about, we're going to see these artworks here around us. and they are pictures of the artists and people at Renaissance. Murals, 8 different full-height murals of classical or ancient authors. What we'll notice is that this is really related to 2 different kinds of ideas about the library. If you look at below each of the murals, there are now bookshelves. There used to be also some park tables, but there are bookshelves, and the bookshelves hold a range of literature from the reference from the side. There's non-fiction and more fiction on the periodical side. This was a contrast, it goes back to the 19th century, of with a public library. Is it supposed to be for the people's entertainment or for the people's edification? So we see the 2 together. And the artworks, I'll explain, represent the highlights of classical tradition and literature. So I'm going to start over here. To the left of the circulation desk. And by the way, I mentioned the circulation desk is integral to the architecture. You can see it's real timber. It's later 6th century. So this first man shows both the blind poet Homer, who goes back to the 7th or 8th century BC, and it shows Pindar the poet. Pindar was the best lyric poet of the early Greek tradition. And this is done in tempera, which is a kind of paint with egg, it uses egg in its composition. Now this one, there's one woman in these murals, and this is Sappho the poet, and she's on the left, and we have Theocrates, the rural poet, wrote up scenes with her, and of course here is goats and other animals of the type of her. This panel is for Greek drama, and it's one of the most important, and it has the most people in it of note. So we have Aeschylus, who wrote Agamemnon, which of course has lots of women in it. Aristophanes, who wrote a comedy about Lysistrata, or Lysistrata, which was a comedy about women getting control over the men in time of war. Sophocles, another tragedy author, Antigone and Oedipus Rex and Euripides, wrote Electra and the Trojan Women. So this is the birth of all drama. After those tragedy writers, it was Shakespeare who then stood out after that. Although the French were big Racine and Corneille, his important ones about tragedy. They get their inspiration from these 4 writers. So now the next man here, this one is one of my favorite. This is my favorite person, Virgil, the poet Virgil. He's Roman now. We've been with the Greeks, but now we're talking about a Roman writer. He wrote the Aeneid, which is about sort of a prequel to the history of Rome. It's about the founding of Rome, somebody who leads the Trojan War. But one of the most famous incidents involves a woman. Also, that's Queen Dido of Carthage. And Aeneas stops for a while and is in her guest with his entourage. Is her guest. But he decides to continue with his journey, and he leaves her, and she's distraught and burns herself on a fire on the beach as he leaves. So, again, a tragic story, but it's only one of many in an episodic work of poetry. And Virgil also wrote many kinds of poems about rural life, also, country life, which it was what Lake Forest was in 1931, in that period. This is the Roman orator Cicero. Now, Cicero isn't sort of known to people today, but in that early 20th century, when people studied, they read both Virgil in high school and also Cicero in high school in the original Latin. So I got Virgil, but I was out by the time I got to Cicero. His orations were famous models of effective public speaking. This military-looking film is Xenophon. Xenophon wrote about war, and he was certainly a notable guy. He had great horses. These figures are philosophers, Diogenes, Aristotle, and Socrates. And Socrates with his scribe, the person who chronicled what he did, Plato. And so these are some of the mainstays of the Greek philosophical tradition. Plato's Republic, for instance, is a good example. And these were considered to be great books. And number 8, this has 2 major figures. One that people will remember from high school or junior high school geometry, which is Pythagoras. He's standing, and then kneeling in front of him is Thales with a tablet, and in Greek says, "Know thyself." So these 8 panels. Now, what was their significance? These were people we were supposed to read. This is 1930. In 1931, these were completed. In the year 1930, Edith Hamilton had published a book called The Greek Way, and she talked about these people as the important foundations of Western civilization, and talked about their simple language. The Greeks had a lot more words for each different variation on a thing than we have, where we use a lot of modifiers and describers for words for nouns. So these pictures are very simple to represent the simple style of Greek writing and Roman writing to some extent. So this was part of the movement. At the University of Chicago, they hired a young man, Robert Hutchins, to be the new president. He was 29 years old in 1929. So he then started a whole Great Books program. By the 1940s, in the summertime, the classes were even going out to Aspen, and there were programs there. And by 1952, they published a set at the University of Chicago, and with the Great Books series, about 52 volumes. And there still is a Great Books reading group in this library that people can join to go through and read great books. But we're looking at the authors of several of the books. Certainly Aristotle, Plato, Virgil. These are the stalwarts of that tradition. Homer, the stalwarts of that great tradition. It's found University of Chicago in the 1940s and late 30s was teaching basically this as the curriculum.
So now we're entering the library's periodical room, the West Reading Room. It has windows on both sides and ends in a fireplace. This room was a very busy place during the 1930s. During a pandemic, it's empty. But let's take a look at the art here. It's outstanding. There are 10 elephant folio, double folio pages of prints. We have 10 of them. 9 of them are waterbirds, and 1 is grouse. And I don't know the name of the donor, but I do know that he must have been a hunter to have collected something here. He had to sneak a grouse into the collection. These came here early in the 30s, and then were discovered to be original Havel elephant folio prints about 2000, and have been restored, many by different donors. So we're going to go around one by one to see the 10 birds of America. Now I'll just say a few things about what that was. It's supposed to be one of the most important books about America, period. And it certainly one of the best, certainly the best known for American books. It was huge. There were 435 prints that were published between 1826 and 1838. So over a dozen years, they were published in little groups sent to the subscribers. There were about 200 sets only. So these 10 prints came from, they're one of 200, and so we know that this is a very scarce kind of print. And these are some of the most important ones, but certainly the most important waterworks in the whole series, the 435. So we'll start by going over to my left, and we'll start with the wood items.
Here we see one of the water birds, certainly a large one, working in its natural habitat, and we could see that it was a very large print, one of the larger bird prints. The bird is larger in the print for this one. Now, Hamill printed these, and I refer to it as a print, which is not entirely accurate. Each of these 200 different copies of this particular one would be slightly different because they were hand-colored over the octant original prints, but they were all hand-colored, and that added a little bit different tone to each individual one. So they're seen as individual works of art. Here we're looking at the king duck or king eider, and this was a bird that was not located in warm places. The wood ibis was seen by Oliver in Louisiana. This one, he actually went up, I think, to he went up to Labrador to see it. It ranged from Labrador to the Arctic, and occasionally would go as far south as Massachusetts, but that's where he saw it up in Labrador. So from 1832 to 34, he painted that. The two different ducks. They're certainly handsome. In 2001, the former head of the public services and reference, Cindy Infantino, donated the restoration of this print to her late husband who died. And so this is one of the ones that has a particular name attached to it. This print shows a blue goose, or and along with what some people thought was a separate species back in the day of a snow goose. They're actually just different seasonal plumages of the same bird. And this was done around 1832, and then the one on the right later, I believe. But that's interesting that scientists have come up with more information about this. But certainly, Audubon noticed both the similarities and the differences. This Audubon bird was restored with funds provided by recently retired library staff member Judy Gallery, and it shows the fascination of the staff with the cooperation that the community provides. It's in honor of the Friends of the Library. Some of Audubon's birds were pretty exclusively northern birds. So here's the Arctic loon, and you can see that that's one that it was also called a diver, but it was done in 1832, and it was from a drawing he made as early as 1820. So this one was given by, the restoration was given by the Friends of the Lake Forest Library in 2001. So now we have the whooping crane. This is one of the largest figures that Audubon was able to crowd off of this double elephant folio page. It was done early in 1821 to 1822, before the publication started. This was one of them that he probably used to help sell the idea to his painting to potential publishers and subscribers. This is one of 200 of the original elephant folio prints, and hand colored. And so it's even though it is very well done to the public and have seen this picture many places. This is one of the rare examples of that to be seen in a public setting. President of the Lake Forest Library was Alfred E. Hamill. He was an investment banker in Chicago, very learned, studied, a great book collector, and he was the president of the library when this building was built. So he worked with Edwin Hill Clark, the architect, on making many of the features that you see. So this is the west fireplace, and it has a carving over it. And it's a carving by Ulrich Longenecker, who was a European artist, sculptor, who'd gone to Milwaukee. Now, Hamill had hired him personally to do 2 centaurs for his house here in Illinois, on Illinois Road in the forest, in the late 20s. So he knew the artist and knew what his work was like. So this is Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson wrote one of his essays was called Nature, and he was interested in the natural world and people's relationship to it. It was very influential in driving the rural movement in this country. So you have all these other birds in the room with the American mid-19th century philosopher Emerson, who was espousing that kind of idea for people's interest. This is the marsh hawk. There's 2 versions of it. And the bottom figure was done in 1820, but it wasn't until 1836 that the top and center birds were added. So we put all these things together in one print. He must have been fascinated by the marsh hawk in his work. So now we're in front of one of my favorite birds, water birds, the cormorant. And these birds are, again, northern birds. So you find them in Labrador, and that's up north beyond Quebec. And that's where they would go for summer. But in winter, they would travel south. And again, I've seen them in Arizona. So the one bird was done, the female with the mother and the little chicks we see there, she's feeding them, is 1833. And then he did the male in 1834. But he had been on a trip to Labrador to see them. And this is in memory of Charles Emerson, also donated, who was quite a reader. As I mentioned before, I think that the collector of all these plates was a hunter. And this is the one that proves it to me. Or let's say suggests it to me. Proof is different. This is the sage grouse. He painted them late 1836 to 1837. And they're still hunted in Wyoming as a bird. But these are grouse, and it's a kind of bird that's popular in Europe, in Scotland for hunting, and certainly Wyoming is someplace that would have been attractive. I'm not sure where he actually found it and painted it. That's the sage grouse. The last of the 10 birds is the golden eagle. And this one was painted in Boston from a specimen that had been captured in the White Mountains of New England in 1833. Now, the picture is, you have to avert the eyes of younger children in looking at this, because he's just grabbed lunch, which is a white bunny. But this is, again, one of the very large water birds. It's not the bald eagle, it's the golden eagle. But it's certainly a very handsome version of one of the most important of the kinds of birds of prey that we've seen here today. And this final one was given by the restoration was donated by the Friends of the Library. So this was a major project of the Friends of the Library and several private donors to make these pictures available and in their best condition.
North reading room off of the east reading room, and we're looking at the portrait of Joseph Addison, the late 17th century, early 18th century author and government servant in Britain. Addison wasn't the first person to write for periodicals, but he was probably the most important, the most prolific, and did the best writing considered by literary historians. This picture was done by Sir Godfrey Kneller, and it's in the style of the prints of one category of prints that he did for the Kit Kat Club, a group that he belonged to that was half political, half literary in England at the time. It's supposed to be School of Kneller because it's not known elsewhere, but because this came to the library in the early 1930s when art values were, we could say, volatile, this could be by Miller. We just don't know. It would take more research to figure that out. But the pose is typical of one kind of Kit Kat Club portrait. He's also known for another Kneller portrait of Joseph Addison that's in the National Portrait Gallery in London that isn't nearly as interesting. So now we're starting a third category of major art, several pieces of a type. And this one is a plan of the landscape for Villa Turca. It was created in part by the Foundation for Architecture and Landscape Architecture in a period from 1926 until 1931. The last summer of the program, 1931, was held in the new library building, actually. And as a result, a lot of their material stayed here. They didn't know there wasn't going to be a program in 1932, or 33, or 34, or 35. By 1935, with David Adler, the architect, as president, I believe, they sadly announced that their training for bringing architects and landscape architects together to collaborate on projects probably wasn't going to be needed, certainly for large residences, for a while, and that the current architects could handle the load. So they closed the program in 1935 completely. Interestingly, though, the prize that they were all coming for in kind of a École des Beaux-Arts spirit of contests, that prize still continues. It's been transferred. The endowment for that from Edward L. Ryerson was transferred to the University of Illinois' landscape program in Urbana-Champaign, and it's still given. There's an annual prize given there. Probably it's a traveling prize, but it was meant for a year abroad. Unfortunately, the prize had the whole program had one limitation. The first year it was co-ed, and a man won the architecture prize and a woman won the landscape architecture prize. This would have been like 1926. The trustees didn't know what to do. They couldn't send off to travel alone together in Europe, unchaperoned, a man and a woman. So they decided to solve the problem by eliminating women from the program. So this was kind of a unique feature of the program, which makes it less interesting than if they had figured out a way to do it with making it co-ed. But that was one of the limitations. After the first year, you don't see work by women. I'm looking here at one of the prints from that period of around 1930 of Villa Turca. This was a 200-acre estate between the south 1857 border of Lake Forest and the 1887 north border of Fort Sheridan. This was property of Harold Mccormick and Edith Rockefeller Mccormick. Now, Edith Rockefeller Mccormick was very much interested in the Italian arts. She was interested in arts and crafts in general. She was John D. Rockefeller's oldest daughter, And she built this place between about 1909 and 1912. The development sort of slowed down at that point. She had a house in the city, and so she only really came out here for daytime things. And one of the reasons for that is they say that during the World War I period, leading up to and during World War I, there was gunnery practice starting at 5 o'clock in the morning at Fort Sheridan to the south. So she would come out for garden days and things like that, but she wasn't staying overnight. Maybe stayed one night and found out that they did gunnery practice. But it's a very nice plan. The house is looking toward the lake on that side, and this is a long access south to a tea house. The tea house still exists. The house has been gone since the 60s. A little bit of the gardens and certainly of the cavalcade, that's not the right word, series of waterfalls down the bluff. I'm not thinking of the right word. Was in this plan, and that's not part of what's in Lake Forest. Is South Circle Lane. This is the plan for the House of the Four Winds by Howard Van Doren Shaw, and Shaw and Edith and Rose Standish Nichols both worked on the Ibero Moorish gardens that are northeast of the house, and shown here. But this, in addition to the plan, there is a section at the bottom of the print which shows how the water flowed downhill from the house toward the northwest. And it went like at the Alhambra or the Generalife above the Alhambra in Granada. The water flowed. It was in the Muslim tradition of prizing water and oases, and this in summer is definitely such a drawing. So this fascinated all kinds of visitors. Always has. It's been restored in around 2000. The plan was restored around 1980 by the Lake Forest Garden Club, as were all of these. But the garden itself was restored in around 2001 by Craig Bergman for the former owners, the Redfields. And this room has 6 prominent large prints by Joseph Pennell, early 20th century artist. And they're all of Greek and Roman ruins subjects. And so they fit the context of this room, which again is one of those, it's like this is the west, this is the east, this is the east reading room. We were in the west reading room before with the Audubon prints. These aren't nearly as significant as the Audubon prints were. But the room is very good, and this carries the theme along very well also, and so it's an important part of the fabric of the library historically. This is the east fireplace. We've seen the west fireplace and the north fireplace, and this is the east fireplace. It's a Georgian split broken pediment, and in the head this time is of the poet John Greenleaf Whittier. Whittier was an important poet, wrote Snowbound, which was a book-length poem, but was also really an important abolitionist, worked on publications and did poetry about the abolition of slavery in the 1840s and 50s. So interesting that he's included here. He was a much revered, in the early 20th century, he was a much revered writer. By Ulrich Longenegger, who was the artist that Alfred Hamel had chosen to do this work. Here we see a major work in Lake Forest in residential architecture of the modern classical style. This is by Delano and Aldrich. It's the Fair Lawn House, 1923, for Mrs. Charles McGann, daughter of Senator Farwell, whose estate had been on The house of the Farwells from 1870 to 1920 burned, and this was the replacement house. We see that there are certain modern tendencies. The repetition in the fencing that you see at the front of the image certainly is suggesting the Art Deco period. It has a definite modern cast to it. But the form is like important colonial houses, and this back porch, this is a back porch, certainly a reminiscent of southern plantation type houses. So it's a very important house. The landscape was redone seamlessly by William Delano himself, who'd been taught by Beatrice Ferrand, who was an important landscape architect in the period. So this is the W.S. Brewster residence. It was called Coventry, and Mrs. Brewster was Kate Brewster, who was one of the main backers of this whole Foundation for Architecture and Landscape Architecture project. She was one of the main promoters of it, and it implies she was a funder of it. She was active at the Art Institute, and did work there. And there's a sculpture in the garden there on the east side of the tracks that she helped dedicate in the 20s. So this shows her gardens. She traveled a lot. She was a major officer, early officer in the Garden Club of America, founded in 1913. She founded their periodical, and she traveled to England. She had met with the major designers. So she had a book that she gave to the library that was presented to her by William Robinson, who was the person who really emphasized the wild garden in English style in opposition to the very manicured English landscape school. So he was a major figure. She knew Gertrude Jekyll. So she knew all the major English gardeners, knew people here, did her own book called The Little Garden for Little Money in about 1923 or 24. That book, what's interesting is that she had lots of money and had a big garden, but she knew how to be economical and do things carefully and to not be extravagant. So this was also part of that Renaissance period that she played a role in. So this is a building that was designed in about 1915 by David Adler. It is the orangerie for the Mrs. Morse Ely estate in Lake Bluff off of Moffett Road, near the lake, but not in view of the lake. This was visited by the Garden Club of America when they came to visit in 1919. And what's fascinating about the garden that you see here in this rendering of the north facade that faced into a large open space, it has a very geometric kind of garden. What you can't see, because there is a plan right here. Yes, there's a geometric garden. You'll have to. Well, I don't want to change the stuff around. But there's also a plan for the garden there, done by Adler. And so this was very advanced and beginning of modern garden style. Slightly abstract, geometric, something that Adler would develop further in the 20s in some of his major houses. So this again is a Foundation for Architecture and Landscape Architecture rendering, rendering at the top and bottom and in the middle, but then over on the left it's a plan for what was a stable building, garage building by Adler around 1924. David Adler did this plan for the Noble Judah estate. And Adler didn't do the main house, that was other architects, but he did this little gem of a garage. This was then converted to a house in 1946 by the owners of the big house, which is over on to the west of it. But in 1946, they took some of the paneling from the main house and brought it into the garage to fill the car spaces with what was supposed to be Louis XV's Regency period paneling that was actually supposed to have belonged to the regent, the Duc d'Orléans. So this is still a little gem that's still on that site. And this was a very detailed plan and rendering of the landscape and the different sides of this house, with a section also. So this is a really interesting estate for a couple of different reasons. This is the Charles B. Pike estate on Lake Road on a relatively small lot that the architect David Adler made look twice as big at least by the innovations that he introduced. First, I'll mention that there's a garden down by the beach. I'd mentioned in an earlier plan about Villa Turco that you could land a plane down on the beach. They built a formal garden down below. What you also can see here is that there is a sort of an angled line going along there. And so this property at the street is its widest. And as it goes to the east, the landscape of the ravine angles to the southeast. And so it's really a triangle. And he makes it feel like it's not a triangle, that it's a big open rectangular space. He does that by using a basement from a previously burned house that's forward from his house, which is close to the road, and then he cuts through, beyond the basement, he cuts through the bluff to create a vista out to the lake. So you're looking at this open vista out. You're seeing the walls on either side. On the left of this open space, you see the garden. That was the garden for the 1905 house that had been built by Arthur Hoyne. And so it's one of the great tour de force efforts of a landscape and building architect in the Chicago region for the way that this masterful use of this space to create one of the most important Italianate estates in the United States. That's what the historian Richard Guy Wilson said when he visited in about 2001. The Foundation for Architecture and Landscape Architecture was a major national project that brought in these students from around the country, the top students, the top graduates of architecture and landscape architecture from around the country. So they did a kind of a contest type format that was typical of the École des Beaux-Arts Paris. They call them concours. They brought in outside architects to be the judges, and then the winners would get the prize. The year's travel, the first prize was travel in Europe for a year. Second prize was travel in the United States for a year. This is one of the kind of problems that they gave out for the contest. And this was a problem to have a playground, park, and hospital all together in one. I'm not sure if that was the existing hospital in Lake Forest that was in a park. It was for infectious diseases, kind of a quarantine park, hospital in a park. But this was a plan for how to design that park area. And this is another alternative plan with the same basic setup as that. So these two go together. They were contest entries from students in the program. But it's good to have a couple of examples. This is the McGann estate again. We've seen another picture of that over on the other wall. This shows a rendering. It shows a plan, but a rendering of the pavilion at the end of what were 1870 arbors there. And William Delano, in doing the landscape, had integrated those arbors into the plan with these two pavilions, to look exactly like it was all part of the same plan. So very masterful. You also see around the house above it, There's a terrace that goes around, and that was the terrace for the 1870 house. So he incorporated the earlier landscape plan into the 1923 plan. As we move around the room, we come to this really interesting tapestry that was done on the occasion of the wings being added to the library in 1978. It was the Danforth firm in Chicago that did this edition, but this tapestry was done by the atelier of Lydia Beckwith Lee, who lived in southeast Lake Forest on the lake. And she had a big room where various people came and also did needlework. Needlework was very popular in that period. So there's a list here of all the women who contributed parts of the designs. There's a small copy here, a shadow of this, with numbers by each set of animals, or each image. They were all done by different contributors. And so it's an idea of when this building was being expanded, that the women of the community got together to celebrate this room, which was originally a garden room. This was for books about gardens and things. So this is a remnant of it. It's really a wonderful work of art, and a tapestry that is memorable. We're down to the last two of the Foundation for Architecture and Landscape Architecture plans, done from 1926 to 1931. This is a plan of Market Square. And what's interesting about this plan is that what's prominent, what's featured isn't the buildings, it isn't the ground and the flowers, it's the trees. And that's because the architect, Howard Van Doren Shaw, who did a third plan with a long park, and at the north is the east. So the train station was on the east side at the top. Then there was a big plaza. Then there was a park with road on either side. And then there was a building at the end with columns. And the columns are shown at the bottom of the plan there. But the trees were a very important part of this. And the trees echoed the columns that were on the buildings, both at the east end and the west end. You'll see they're actually piers. They're kind of squared piers at the east end on the two buildings. And then the central building on the west has round Tuscan columns. So the trees were all elm trees, and they formed like columns in between the east and the west masonry columns. So this was a unique kind of garden approach of having the garden plants fit into the rhythm of the built building pillars. And so it's really kind of an interesting early modern approach. Market Square's style was basically traditional, but it also had modern elements in small amounts elsewhere in it. But these trees, this plan focuses on the trees and makes it very interesting. So here we're looking at our last of the plans that were done, that were restored and framed by the Lake Forest Garden Club. And this one is of the E.L. Ryerson Estate, one of the most famous of the Lake Forest estates. It's no longer extant. The house was torn down the night before Lake Forest's first preservation ordinance went into effect, and the landscape was divided into several lots. But the property was amazing. The park part, the landscape part was by Judson, but the garden part was by Shaw, the architect Howard Shaw, and his staff. And I think his principal designer then, David Adler, created the long alley from the house across to the garden, which is to the north. This view is looking west. There's a pool at the north end, or on the right, And the gardens were planted by Rose Standish Nichols, but David Adler, it was his idea to have the framed vista down to the pool from the house, which isn't in the plan. So this concludes the review of three major categories of art in this building. It makes it one of the most important single building representational art collections in the Chicago area. Other ones that I can think of are those at the Union League Club and at the Newberry Library. But this is, let's say this is in that league of major art collections that are of importance, not just in the city, but regionally.